pinned by desire, unstitched by lies. I measure people for a living. Before a stitch ever bites cloth, I stand in their space and read the language that fabric will have to translate, how they carry apologies in their shoulders, where pride lives at the base of the spine, which wrist tells time better than the face on their watch. I work in a narrow atelier tucked between a florist and a wine bar, with a bell on the door and a window that keeps flirting with the afternoon sun. My name is Mark, and I make suits for people who think they've outgrown costumes. My wife, Lena, understood the theater of it. She was a publicist for a fashion house whose runway shows were engineered weather, storms timed to music, thunder made of applause. When we met, I was still sharing a cutting table with a man who believed in glue as much as needle. She walked in carrying a garment bag that cost more than my sewing machine and asked if I altered fate as well as lapels. I told her I did not, then let her talk me into believing otherwise. The early days were short and lit like a secret. We toasted with cheap Prosecco in coffee mugs and kissed among chalk dust and pinned hems, movements careful but impatient, laughter always finding a way into our mouths. She said my hands felt like decisions. I said hers felt like a door I couldn't afford and still somehow owned. 3 years later, the bell on the door had learned my moods and Lena's calendar had learned to ignore me. She was building a world where everyone wanted to be, and I was building jackets that made people look like they belonged there. She promised evenings that slipped into nights. I promised to wait near the iron until the last train of steam finally forgot its own name. Arya walked in on a Monday that smelled like rain rehearsing. She didn't belong to any of the tribes I know at a glance. No finance hair, no actor's posture, no politician's grin. She wore a cream blouse and dark trousers, and an expression I have only ever seen on people who expect rooms to be kind but have a plan if they are. "I've been told you can make a suit that listens," she said, running her fingers over a bolt of charcoal wool as if testing its honesty. "I can make one that doesn't interrupt," I answered. I heard my own voice soften around her. "What's the occasion?" "A life," she said, smiling as if it were a very reasonable thing to need. "Gallery opening. My first curation, not just a hands-in ladder job. I want to look like I know where every painting goes even when I don't." We set the appointment for a fitting then and there. When I reached for the measuring tape, the room shifted the way it does when sound decides to listen. There's a ritual to it. I stand close enough to borrow the warmth of a person, but not their breath. I wrap a soft ruler around the invisible. I call out numbers that mean patience in my head and geometry out loud. On Arya, the tape felt like a whisper I'd promised not to repeat to anyone. "Arms out," I said, and she lifted them in a smooth arc, a sunrise of muscle and intention. "Relax," I added, because bodies lie when they're trying to impress you. "This feels intimate," she said. "Not an apology, a note." "It is," I said, "and it is. We both agree on the part that keeps us honest." She laughed lightly, and I felt the room meet her halfway. I measured shoulders, chest, waist. At the neck I paused where skin remembers secrets. She didn't flinch. We spoke about lapel width and art that makes you step back before you dare go closer. I suggested a double-breasted cut, softened with a light roll. She countered with a single-breasted jacket that thought about mischief but behaved in photographs. We compromised the way two people do when they're both listening. When she left, the tape around my neck felt warmer. I returned to the cutting table and drew her silhouette from memory in chalk. The garment took shape with an eagerness that felt like gossip. At home that night, the apartment smelled like a candle that wanted to be a beach. Lena arrived late, shoes in hand, lipstick intact, a sure sign she'd been smiling for cameras rather than people. She kissed my cheek in the way you do when time is polite but not generous. While she showered, her phone buzzed where she dropped it on the kitchen counter, a small tremor of planned importance. I don't make a habit of peeking. I make a habit of not being a fool. The text preview was from a number saved as JM. You don't need to be clever to suspect the initials belong to a man whose name moves furniture in certain rooms. Tomorrow. Side entrance. I liked the idea of seeing the collection alone first. There was a winking emoji that felt like an invoice. I put the phone down as if it were a hot pan and told myself I could bake patience like bread if I tried. Arya's second fitting was the kind of appointment a month has been practicing for. She wore a pale camisole beneath the half-basted jacket and stepped onto the fitting block as if it were a promise that didn't owe anyone a receipt. I pinned the sleeves and smoothed the back. The fabric remembered her immediately. We stood close, tailor and client, man and possibility, and my hand hovered at the curve of her waist while I asked it to behave. "You're quiet," she said. "I like it when tools are." I smiled at the mirror and at the way she noticed, felt the prickle of a blush try to pretend it was the room getting warmer. "You want the jacket to talk," I said, "not me." She glanced at my wedding ring. Her gaze wasn't a question, it was an acknowledgement. "Does your wife ever get jealous of how you look at fabric?" she asked. "Only when it looks back," I said. We laughed softly together, the sound private and safe. When I stepped in front to check the front balance, our eyes met in the mirror. There is a moment during a fitting when the mirror stops being about appearances and starts being a confession booth. We lived there for one honest breath. Then I tugged the hem and called for the hem from the back room, and the spell, such as it was, put itself away with good manners. The next evening I found out who JM was without trying. The fashion house Lena worked for was hosting a preview for press and preferred donors. My name on the list got me in, and my marriage kept me near the wall. Julian Markel moved like a man who expects glassware to get out of his way. He was the European director of something important enough that everyone made a small lake of attention for him to skate across. Lena, in a black dress that interpreted starlight, stood close enough for her laugh to reach him without needing to raise its voice. They didn't touch. They performed something worse, plausible deniability with perfect blocking. When the last of the cameras sighed and the room turned to canapes and low notes, Julian leaned down and said something only her ear was invited to. She tilted her face toward him, hair like a rumor against his lapel, and I felt a tiny thread in me pull until it found where it had been tied, and then it snapped. I don't cut, not when it comes to people. I alter. I take in, let out, move seams until truth hangs right. My revenge, if we're calling it that, would be tailoring. 2 weeks later, my atelier hosted a trunk show to show off my spring line, 12 looks, 6 clients who agreed to smile, a jazz trio that understood volume like etiquette. I sent invitations like darts, one to Lena, of course, one gracious, civil to Julian, one to Arya with a sticky note that said simply, "It listens." I prepared jackets and small speech and a pocket full of patience. The room glowed. It is a small miracle what lamplight and music can do to a space that has watched you swear at zippers. Clients arrived in pairs and solos and took their places as if the chairs had been waiting just for them. Lena came late, placing air kisses where they buy influence. Julian came right on time, a decision in a suit, and took a seat where the sightline to my little platform was perfect. I presented the line like a confession you've ironed. Linen whispered, wool purred, silk let the room believe in mercy. When Arya stepped out in her suit, the jazz trio softened, and people did the polite gasp that makes a tailor remember he has a heart. She looked like a verdict you were happy to receive. I watched her body inhabit the work we'd made together. I watched the mirror at the back of the room catch 1,000 small recognitions. Lena clapped with 2 fingers against her palm, the way chic people do when they need to protect their rings. Julian watched with an interest he was careful to keep somewhere between personal and acquisitive. I swallowed the urge to point at them both and shout measurements nobody had paid for. I didn't need to. I had stitched the truth already. In the left interior breast pocket of the sample jacket I wore that night, the one I always try out on myself before I let it go live, I had sewn a label, not my usual square of white with my name and year. A different one, cut from the same silk as Lena's black dress that evening, a scrap I'd found at the back of our closet in a bag from a hotel whose scent lived longer than its guests. On it, I had embroidered a line of script so small that only someone standing very close would be able to read it. A suit remembers the hands that unbutton it. When the show ended and I stepped down, people crowded me the way kindness sometimes does. An avalanche of congratulations, orders, gently aggressive praise. Julian reached me first, his smile the exact temperature of expensive olive oil. "Exquisite," he said. "You found the line between disciplined and alive." "I'm a line worker," I said and shook the hand he offered. "Thank you for coming." Lena slipped her arm through his for 1 second too long before withdrawing, the choreography of people who live in photographs. She kissed my cheek and let the camera catch it. "You keep improving," she said, and I thought of the little label listening from inside my jacket. Arya waited. She has the gift of not interrupting the sky while the sun is doing something dramatic. When the room's attention slackened, she approached me, the suit on her moving the way a good secret does when it belongs to the right person. "May I?" she asked, and her hand hovered over the lapel of the jacket I wore. I nodded. She slid 2 fingers inside the breast pocket with the kind of care that made the inside of my ribs learn something new about air. She touched the label, felt the raised script, and then, with a glance that grazed Lena and Julian and returned to me with a question, she read. Her eyebrows made a small, sympathetic movement. She withdrew her hand and, without fanfare, buttoned my jacket for me, fingers deft and respectful, a courtesy so intimate my throat had to remember how to swallow. "Sometimes clothes are braver than people," she said. "Sometimes they help," I answered. Lena's eyes met mine briefly across the room. I don't know if she saw the label's weight in my pocket. I do know that something in her performed a mental arithmetic with new numbers, and her smile, for a moment, came unstitched. We didn't make a scene. We made arrangements. That night, after the last flute glass surrendered to the tray and the jazz trio packed their gentleness away, Lena and I walked home together. It was a quiet that didn't accuse. In our kitchen, she poured water and I washed a glass I'd already washed. We stood shoulder to shoulder like 2 tailors making a single jacket. "I didn't mean to be cruel," she said finally. "I meant to be seen." "I saw you," I said. "You changed rooms." We sorted the inventory of an ending without swinging any heavy tools. She would stay with her sister for a while. I would keep the apartment and the plant that likes me better. We would tell our friends together so nobody had to choose a team. When we hugged goodnight, it was careful like a good hem, secure, no showy knots. Days learn new habits quickly when you give them something honest to hold. The atelier became companionable. The iron sighed in appreciation rather than in warning. The bell announced people with the exact right noise. Arya's pickup day arrived like a favor the week decides you've earned. She slipped into the suit behind the curtain and stepped out transformed, not by the cloth, but by the way it admitted her into herself. "Walk," I said, and she did, down the little runway of my rug, turning with an economy that put a blush in my chest. I adjusted a cuff and straightened a collar and pretended those gestures weren't choices I had been waiting to make. "You'll come," she asked, head tilted, "to the opening." "I make a habit of studying my work in the wild," I said, "because pride and invitation are the same suit in different light." The gallery was a former bakery with plaster that had learned to keep quiet. Arya's show was about thresholds, doorways, windows, the mouths of tunnels, bridges caught mid-breath. People stood under frames and forgot their bodies for a while. I drifted from canvas to canvas and tried to ignore the part of me that had always wanted to be a painting. She found me near a photograph of a hotel corridor, empty and full at the same time. "This one," she said, "got me in trouble. The owner thought it made his place look haunted. I told him that's what a story is, a haunting that asks to be welcomed." We stood close, two people deciding to be a little more accurate. Her hand slipped into the crook of my elbow as naturally as if the jacket had been cut with it in mind. I turned toward her slowly, so the room could keep up, and let my fingers find the curve at her waist where fabric becomes secret. "I'm not in a hurry," she said, reading me the way a good client reads a tailor. "But I'm not in denial either." We kissed like a perfect seam, no show, all strength. The taste of her was not something I'll tell the internet about, the feel of her was. She was warm and deliberate and more amused than solemn. My palm lay flat on her back, careful of the suit we had made and the person inside it. When we parted, the gallery's hum blended back into us, and a painting over my shoulder looked like it was trying not to smirk. Julian sent a text the next morning addressed to both Lena and me, full of corporate grace and the kind of apology that never admits it wore a tuxedo to the wrong place. I wished them luck aloud to my empty kitchen and meant it more than I expected. Some fits just aren't yours. In the atelier, I took out a fresh label and stitched it into the inside of Arya's spare jacket. I used navy silk and a hand that didn't shake. The words were smaller this time, a promise rather than a warning, measured by kindness. When she came to pick it up, the bell did its perfect act, and she did hers, walking through my doorway like a person who knows the room is rooting for her. She read the label, pressed her forehead lightly to mine in a gesture so simple a censor wouldn't bother, and smiled. I wrapped an arm around her, drew her in, and felt the city outside practice its breathing while our little room got better at telling the truth. I still measure people for a living. I still believe fabric listens if you ask nicely. I've learned that some seams hold by grace more than tension. I keep a needle threaded on the workbench for emergencies and a bottle of Prosecco in the back for kindness. When the bell rings and a new story steps through my door, I reach for my tape and my better self, and I begin where I always do, at the place on the neck where we all remember we're worth mending.